The core of my presentation today will focus on Wallingford in Oxfordshire. Can I just ask, how many people have been there? Who's been to Wallingford? Two hands are going up. Right, I'll make sure to introduce you to Wallingford in a thorough way. I mean, to me it's a very special place, and I think it's fair to say that Wallingford, certainly in medieval archaeology, has attained the status of a classic site. It's a classic site. It's often cited in the literature, but I would argue until quite recently was poorly understood. The themes I'd like to look at really, I want to draw on the results of a project that's really been running for the last 10 years, has culminated in a monograph published last Friday. I'm very pleased about that. I want to draw on the results of the project and in a sense talk about, first and foremost, the development of a town through time, the biography of urban space at Wallingford. But I want to be very careful and not just talk about the narrative of a particular town. I want to try and key my talk in to different debates within medieval archaeology and urban history. I have a particular interest, as you're now aware, of castles in their landscape and in their social context, and I will focus, certainly towards the end of this presentation, on the castle at Wallingford. And I suppose that the key of my presentation, the key to my presentation, is that I feel that Wallingford provides us with a snapshot of the urban personality of medieval England. I'll elaborate on that a little bit later on. Okay, for those of you that don't know where Wallingford is, it's a modestly sized market town, about 45 miles west of London. It's here, it's midway between Oxford and Reading, down here. There we are. Point away. And in the archaeological literature, in the historical literature, it is of course best known as a burh. It is in many senses one of the quintessential burhs of Wessex. It's one of 33 fortified places in Wessex listed in the 10th century document known as the Burgle Hidage. To give an idea of the scale of the defences and the scale of this burh, in the Burgle Hidage, Wallingford has attached to it the same number of hides, which are there to provide for its defence, the same number as the great Wessex capital of Winchester. It's an enormous site and is a classic point of reference in any debates about burhs and the Burgle Hidage. And I really want to stress there, when I talk about burhs, I emphasise these are fortified places. Burh, the word burh does not necessarily equate to a town. Wallingford also has, you may laugh at this caption, I don't know, Wallingford burh defence is the best preserved in England. They are the best preserved Anglo-Saxon burh defences anywhere in England. The only possible equivalent is at Wareham, down in Dorset, where around the burh, around the modern town, you have earthwork defences. And they look a little bit more impressive than this, and that's because they were used as anti-tank defences. They were reshaped as anti-tank defences in the Second World War. So Wallingford has the best preserved burgle defences of all. Although you wouldn't guess it, it's full of shopping trolleys and debris today. But you get some idea of the scale of the bank and the ditch around the burh. So it's well known, celebrated as a burh. I guess rather less well known is the castle at Wallingford. Many visitors to the site today actually fail to recognise the castle, as a castle because of its lack of masonry remains. It has precisely 3 stubs of masonry sticking up above ground, and it's largely preserved as a very extensive, complex, multi-phase earthwork site. And later on in the presentation I want to unpick the development of that castle, because it's a very interesting and important sequence, I would argue. But it's odd, it was a large, important urban castle that is now in effect in a rural setting. And it's almost unique among the great urban castles of England in that it's preserved as an earthwork site. If you think of the obvious urban castles of Oxford and Lincoln and so on, they're of course still in urban settings. They've been built over the generations. Wallingford should be a playground for archaeologists given the conditions of earthwork preservation. Okay, The topography of Wallingford should make a little bit more sense from this rather splendid, I think, aerial photograph, courtesy of the Environment Agency. One of the advantages of carrying out fieldwork at Wallingford is that the aerial photographic coverage is superb, and the LiDAR coverage, if you don't know what LiDAR is, I'll bring that in at the end of the presentation, is also superb. And it's because it's, of course, Wallingford sits alongside the River Thames, and it's prone to flooding. And the Environment Agency have flown LiDAR and taken lots and lots of aerial photographs to map episodes of flooding. So here you see it a few years ago, with the Thames almost re-flooding the castle ditches. But to give you a sense of the topography of Wallingford, the defences of the Burh embrace 43 hectares. It's a sub-rectangular perimeter on 3 sides against the River Thames. But the aerial photograph shows evidence of a rather unusual pattern of urban development. Houses and streets never took up the entire area within the defences, and you have 3 open greenfield sites that are there for us to look at as archaeologists. We've got 3 areas that are important. Over here I've already mentioned the castle meadows. The castle was imposed in the north-east corner of the Burh. Initially it's quite a limited site. I'll reconstruct it later on, but later enlarged so that its precincts took up virtually an entire quarter of the town. And 2 other areas are of interest. The Bullcroft up here, which is the site of the until recently lost Benedictine Priory, and down in the southwest corner, an area called the Kinecroft. And these are prime areas for archaeological scrutiny, and I'll draw out some of the main conclusions from our project later on. To give an outline of Wallingford's urban story, it was founded in the 870s, 880s. I won't go into the detail of precisely when in that range we think it was founded. But we argue it's not until the 10th century that you see serious population growth and church foundation within the Burh. By Doomsday, by 1086, Wallingford has a population of about 2,000. And by this point, this is really quite important, although it's a very modest market town today. At that point, it was within England's top 20 medieval towns. Incredibly important place. And we think the population peaked probably around 1100. Thereafter, it has a very unusual urban sequence. Decay sets in very early, and urban decay is very profound. By 1334, population of 1,250 or so, it's outside the top 100 towns. By the 1520s, it's outside the top 300 towns. And the tipping point in Wallingford's fortunes seems to come early, probably before 1300, for reasons that I will explore later on. So my presentation today is drawing on the results of the Wallingford Burh to Borough research project. I should emphasise right from the start that this is a collaborative piece of work articulated through the University of Leicester with Neil Christie, the University of Oxford with Helena Hamerow, and myself at the University of Exeter. And we were very keen, as I said at the start of my presentation, to make sure that the project wasn't simply a narrative of a town through time, the story of a town. We wanted to key it into and make contributions to different areas of debate within medieval urban history and medieval archaeology, and I've picked out 4 major areas of debate there. First of all, we're very keen to contribute to debates on the emergence and the functions of small towns. Certainly in the archaeological world, small towns, market towns of Wallingford's size, certainly in the later medieval period, small towns are the poor relation to the major urban case studies of Lincoln and York and London that we read about constantly in the literature. So we're keen to pioneer and refine methodologies for investigating the archaeologies of smaller towns. We were interested in the question of Wallingford's origins. Was it planned from the outset as a town or a proto-town, or was it established as a fortress? Of course, given my interests, another major theme was to look at the impact of different structures of power within the townscape. In particular, bridging the Saxo-Norman divide, questioning the impact of the Norman conquest on townscape as a whole. Fourth and finally, we're interested in the circumstances of Wallingford's decline. Did the pattern of decline that left the town plan punched full of those open spaces, was that the result of macro level processes, nationwide processes, regional processes, or are we looking at a more individual biography of a town? I would probably argue the last one. Okay, in terms of our methodologies, I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking through the methodologies, because I think what we were trying to achieve with the methodologies was quite distinctive. We took the view right from the start that a single set-piece excavation on a choice site somewhere in Wallingford probably wasn't the best approach. Our approach used multiple methodologies and adopted a multi-stage approach. Given that the earthwork preservation of the castle and those open areas within the town, we carried out large-scale topographical survey and geophysical survey, both magnetometry and resistivity, on all the open areas that we could possibly get at, and use that first stage of fieldwork as a basis to plan subsequent excavations targeted to answer particular questions. Alongside those techniques, here you see that's a plot of the archaeology of the Bullcroft somewhere within that mess, the remains of the Benedictine Priory. Alongside those methods, we looked closely at any standing medieval buildings. We carried out a programme of garden archaeology, which is maybe it's a controversial technique. It's becoming very popular in archaeological circles, but there's a great deal of debate about precisely what it can tell us. A programme of garden archaeology in private gardens, more of that in a second, and 10 excavations of about that sort of size to answer particular questions targeted at particular features of the townscape. Here are some slides of our garden archaeology programme. Now, the beauty of garden archaeology is that it allowed us to work in tandem, in partnership with the local community. Through the project, crucial to its success was the relationship with the local archaeological society and Wallingford Museum, a very energetic group of volunteers who run this museum. And we involved them in a programme of garden archaeology, which involved, we're up to about 52 pits, 2 by 1 metre pits in private gardens. And this is an exercise that was really led by the local community as a fantastic way of engaging them in the process of fieldwork. And using the results of garden archaeology, it is possible to plot the distribution, of course, being an archaeologist, of different pottery of different dates through the various time periods. And I do want to stress, however, that our phasing of Wallingford is not based purely on this. It's an amalgamation of lots and lots of evidence. This is probably 2 or 3% of the evidence. I wouldn't ever want to claim to be able to phase the development of something as complex as a town from test pits. The beauty of the archaeology of Wallingford, incidentally, is that you encounter natural deposits often within 1.2 metres. So these test pits can really achieve something in a way that test pits in York could never do. Okay, so this community heritage, community archaeology approach was critical to our project. It's of course critical to gaining funding for these sorts of projects in the present environment. Co-creating knowledge through archaeology, training archaeologists of the future. Another important part of the project was trying to realise the immense potential of past excavations within the town. Excavations that took place for one of 2 reasons. There's a series of research excavations from the 1890s into the 1970s, which remained unpublished, that we brought to publication in our monograph. Very briefly, what's happening here? This is the excavation, it's a piecemeal excavation of a mid-Saxon cemetery, just rather tantalisingly outside the southwest corner of the Burh. Helena Hamerow has brought that to publication within our monograph. The slides at the bottom, this is a piece of excavation 1968, 69, 1970, conducted by a medieval historian, in fact. More of that later on. But what you're looking at here is a box grid excavation of the road going north, going into the north gate of the Burh. So we brought that to publication as well. The other type of excavation is, of course, developer-funded or development-led archaeology. At Wallingford, there's an important piece of developer-led archaeology in 1972, which we brought to publication. This is a remarkable building. I won't say what it is now, I'll leave that till later. It's within the castle. Okay? I'll leave it hanging. There's a whole suite, however, of other much more recent development-led, developer-funded excavations within the town. One of the key pieces of work was 6 years ago. Northampton Archaeology excavated one of the main medieval cemeteries, right at the heart of the Burh, excavated 520-something skellies, which gave us the first insight into the medieval population of Wallingford. And the challenge for us is to collate, to access the results from this sort of work that typically remains in the domain of grey literature, sort of semi-published literature, often on the shelf of the county archaeologist. The challenge is to bring this work together, to collate it, to synthesise it. Reanalysing Wallingford's material culture, I'm showing some of the juiciest finds from the medieval town here, that again we brought to publication in our monograph. These are the juiciest of all. Top right is a Viking Age bone skate. There's a whalebone weaving sword on the left. This is a fairly famous object in the British Museum. It's a late Anglo-Saxon Fenley seal that we've published. This, rather embarrassingly, is an Anglo-Saxon sword hilt that we found by sieving the backfill from one of the previous excavations. I won't say which one. I think finally, the final piece in this particular jigsaw, we've worked in partnership with Reading Museum, who hold an enormous assemblage of finds in their River Finds collection. It's an assemblage of artefacts that were dredged from the River Thames, mainly in the last 50 or 60 years. And we've catalogued, photographed, brought to publication the objects in the stretch of Thames, the stretch of the River Thames immediately adjacent to Wallingford. I won't go into it in any detail, but take it from me. There's a very striking proportion of medieval, and in particular early medieval, weaponry within the Thames. A striking proportion of these objects are bent in some sort of way. Is this deliberate? Is this the action of the objects being rolled around in the river? We don't quite know, but publishing those has been integral to our project. Finally, on the methodology side, I'm just going to show you very, very quickly a series of slides taken from the project GIS, which give you an idea of the sort of challenge involved in collating and synthesising this very diverse archaeology. That is Wallingford. That, of course, is the River Thames. These are the burglar fences. That's the castle. Just plot on various categories of evidence very, very quickly. That's the extent of our magnetometry survey, trying to hoover up all the open areas we could. That's the extent of our resistivity survey. It's really the castle which we have quite startling new information on. Then on top of that, those are the locations of our main excavation trenches, 10 of them in all. On top of that, you can plot in all the garden archaeology pits, and on top of that, all the developer-funded work. So you get an idea of the challenge that you're confronted with, trying to piece together the archaeology of even a very modest market town. Okay, I haven't mentioned the documentary evidence in any detail so far. There is undoubtedly a follow-on project on the documents from Wallingford. We really only dipped into the Burh court rolls in particular, a magnificently well-preserved source of information. We worked with Chris Dyer of the University of Leicester on the Burh court rolls. Chris looked at a sample of the Burh court rolls and was able to do things such as plot the hinterland of Wallingford. You see one representation of the hinterland there. He was able to look at the occupations of people within Wallingford, medieval Wallingford, in particular in the 13th century. There are over 50 occupations represented. Just one little piece of information from this exercise. I mean, Chris Dyer stressed that some of the occupations in Wallingford, were not the sorts of occupations you might expect in a small market town. There are lots and lots of vintners, there are lots of goldsmiths, there are huntsmen and crossbowmen, and I think they speak of the high status associations of the place. Okay, moving on. For the remainder of my presentation, I want to take you through the key findings from the Burh to Borough project, working through the material more or less chronologically, starting off quite briefly actually with the Burgle period. Was Wallingford planned as a proto-town or a fortress? It was. All our evidence points in the same direction. Wallingford was planned as a fortress, as a fortification. The defences were complex. They took up an enormous area of the Burh. There was almost certainly a double ditch, a rampart, which of course would have been topped with a palisade. There was an internal ditch that demarcated perhaps the military zone. Formal gateways, of course. And on the east side of the River Thames, Wallingford was accompanied by a defended bridgehead. In terms of settlement in the early period, in the early Burgle period, all the evidence points in the same direction, that the only settled area of the Burh was one quarter, down here in the southeast corner. The southeast quarter had an established gridded layout and was occupied from a relatively early period of the Burh's history. Rather strangely, however, there's good evidence that although the interior of the Burh has great open spaces within it, yet there was a suburb outside the south gate, probably predated the Burh. There's a few important points there. So there are extensive open spaces. What were these open spaces there for? Are they there for marshalling armies, accommodating refugees? Are they there for marketing activities? We simply don't know, but this open spaces are preserved within the Burh from a very early date. We also postulate that in the northeast corner of the Burh was a royal antecedent to the castle in some form. Would you style it as a palace or a royal compound? We don't quite know, but you can cross-examine me on precisely why I think that's the case later on. But we're pretty certain that there was a royal site in the northeast corner that the castle later perpetuates. Okay, inspirations for the Burgle plan. Of course, I say that the Burh was a fortress, but it is of course also an emblem of manifestation of developing kingship, and it's hard not to see deeper levels of meaning in that very regular Burgle plan. Here I'm drawing on a couple of slides from Keith Lilly's recent book, The City and Cosmos. Look at how those plans compare with Wallingford. These rectangular or square forms with plans divided very, very neatly into quarters. is there some sort of sense that a plan like Wallingford's is a piece of planning in a sort of quasi-Roman image? Is there any sense that there's a Christian cosmology that's represented in that type of planning, with a crossroads right at the heart of the Burh? Moving on, those are some thoughts about the Burgle period. Moving on to the Norman conquest. Wallingford features very prominently indeed in narratives of the Norman conquest. It's famously the place where Duke William's armies crossed the River Thames on his circuitous march on London. It's even been argued recently by Catherine Keats-Rowan in a paper. She flies the kite that Wallingford could have featured in the final or the penultimate scene of the Bayeux Tapestry. May or may not be. Of course, the main archaeological evidence for the Norman conquest comes in a blindingly obvious way in the form of the castle. Wallingford Castle is one of about 50 urban castles, and it's very readily characterised as a symbol, as a stamp of Norman conquest. That is the motte, of course. I should make the point that the masonry structure that you see on the top is a 19th century folly. There are no medieval foundations at all on top of that. Okay, but the archaeology of... here's an overall plan of how the town may have looked in about 1100. My point is, it's very easy to see the castle as a stamp of Norman imposition and Norman conquest, but it would be pushing it really to say that the townscape is transformed as a result of the Norman conquest. Rather, I suggest that the way that royal power is manifested is sort of reconfigured. We make the argument that the castle is imposed on an earlier Anglo-Saxon royal site. The other major change to the townscape is the imposition of a Benedictine priory, very shortly after the conquest. The castle is almost twinned with a new priory imposed in that open, before the conquest this area is open, in that corner. And it transforms the northern third, really, of the Burh into a tangibly elite enclave. Other than that, the changes are not particularly profound. There's some limited infilling of open spaces, and somewhere within that town plan lurks the mysterious French borough that's recorded in Domesday. I can fly a kite in a moment about where I think it was. But moving on. The archaeology of the early castle, the early phases of the castle, very, very difficult to get at. There have been, I think, 12 separate excavations on the castle site by our project and other development-led work. It's only in one location that the early Norman phases have been encountered. They're many metres down, and it's this rather humble, drier feature here. It's, of course, the archaeology of the later castle that survives to a much greater extent and is easier to engage with and encounter. Here you see, this is our excavation of part of a service range and probably a wine cellar. This is the enigmatic. Remember the image from 1972 with two people with 1970s haircuts excavating within it? This is a magnificent site. It's the excavation of a cob kitchen. It's the castle kitchens built in the 1220s. They were excavated in the 1970s and we brought them to publication. There's a cob-built kitchen here and an ancillary structure of some sort here with various ovens and other features. It's clearly the castle kitchen. One of the great problems is that the bone assemblage wasn't properly recorded or curated. We have a fairly limited bone assemblage that shows they're eating lots of pork, unsurprisingly. Okay, the other aspect of the early castle's archaeology that I'll mention now is Wallingford as a conflict landscape. I'm sure that many people in the audience, we can talk about this later on, but Wallingford is famously subject of 3 separate sieges, separate siege episodes in the Civil War of the mid-12th century. And it's very clear from the evidence of chroniclers that a number of siege works and siege castles were erected in opposition to Wallingford Castle. The exact number is very, very difficult to calculate. It's between 2 and 5 siege castles. It's difficult to work out when they're newly constructed and when the besiegers reoccupy existing works. Anyway, we've looked very closely at the area on the east bank of the River Thames, in the area of the bridgehead in particular. That is the bridgehead. And think we've pinned down the locations of 2 of these castles. The most secure one is here, Cromarsh Castle. As I say, we've pinned it down. It's actually a piece of developer-funded excavation 2 years ago by the Museum of London Archaeology Service. Carried out an evaluation and found evidence of Stephen's siege castle, which was an enormous ringwork right at the end of the Great Stone Bridge over the River Thames. We think, in this mess here, that you might have another siege work on this side, integrated into the bridgehead defences. One of my favourite archaeological expressions is, with the eye of faith. With the eye of faith, you may have a separate work there. Anyway, today, there were 2 members of staff associated with the Civil War project were resurveying areas of the bridgehead, and they're going to be doing some more work over the coming weeks. So we'll see what comes out of that. But that's Wallingford as part of a conflict landscape. Okay, this is a reconstruction of how Wallingford, 1/4 of it, could have looked in 1100. This is based on our excavations in the Kinecroft. So Wallingford in 1100, the idea here is sort of Wallingford, sort of faded grandeur, shabby chic, if you like. The idea is that the Burgle defences are tatty and decaying. This is the intramural ditch I mentioned. That's the west gate into the town. But even at this time, this is Wallingford absolutely at its peak. Even in 1100, there are still large open spaces, areas pretty much with a rural character within that defended area. One of the highlights from the excavations I haven't got time to talk about, here in the Kinecroft, our excavation showed that a medieval street popped up and then sort of popped down again within a couple of generations. A couple of generations of timber buildings associated with a cutting through the borough defences. Sometimes the dating is a little bit difficult, but we think this development was there certainly by 1100. Timber buildings would pop up and pop down again, and then the area reverts back to pasture. Is there any possible argument that this could be the French borough? This is really, really flying the kite without a whole lot of evidence. But in Domesday Book there is a French borough. There are houses in which the Frenchmen live. Could that be the French borough? Could it be a population displaced when the castle is constructed? I don't know. But this is one area of change in the townscape in the wake of the Norman Conquest. Okay, so moving on to the later medieval development, in particular here of the castle, but also the town. What you're looking at here is, I think it's quite a nice image, based on our resistivity surveys of the castle area. Sometimes when I show this in lectures, I think it looks a bit like the Turian Shroud. I don't know if you can see the face of somebody if you sort of squint hard enough. That's a resistivity of the Castle Meadows area, showing the survival of major below-ground structures. Combining that with the magnetometry evidence, with the earthwork survey, it is clear, I mean I think I can say it is clear, that Wallingford was, by the middle of the 13th century, was a concentric castle. It had 3 curtain walls, 3 successive curtain walls. The outer one is here. Okay. Now, there are 2 archaeological interventions into this, the outer wall, and the evidence again points in the same direction that this is the wall is built in the mid 13th century. It's almost certainly a refortification of the site by Richard Earl of Cornwall, probably in the 1240s or 1250s. He transforms Wallingford Castle into a concentric show castle, I would probably characterise it as. An intriguing thing about it is that these concentric defences are only provided on one side of the castle, on the north side of the castle. So they'd be visible to anybody coming into the town from the north. You'd be struck by this image of 3 successive curtain walls, each one taller, higher than the one in front of it. It's fairly early for a concentric castle. Without getting into the hard castleological facts, concentric castle planning is, in the literature, commonly taken to be an innovation, of course, of the later 13th century. The Tower of London and Caerphilly are shown there. Is there any possibility, this is the 3rd kite that I've flown in this particular paper, is there any possibility that a source of inspiration for Wallingford Castle's very unusual plan at this stage, the 1240s, 1250s, comes from Richard Earl of Cornwall's activities at Ascalon, where I'm very grateful to Dennis Pringle at Cardiff for pointing this out to me. It's a reference that you see there to Richard being personally involved in the refortification of the castle at Ascalon. This is very important. It's not the fortified town of Ascalon, but this thing up here, the castle of Ascalon. So his refortification in the early 1240s of Ascalon involved the construction of a double wall enclosing it. Is there any sense that Richard is drawing upon that sort of influence, that sort of planning, when he refortifies Wallingford Castle? I have to be very, very careful here. I mean, the whole idea, as you're well aware, of the Crusades as an axis of sort of influence in the diffusion and the spread of military architecture is very dodgy, it's very tarnished, it's deeply unfashionable. But here you have a pretty seriously direct link between 2 sites. Is it coincidental? I've said that a couple of times. Is it coincidental that the only town anywhere in medieval England, the only town or city anywhere in medieval England that has concentric city defences is Oxford, a few miles to the north of Wallingford? The concentric defences of Oxford date, as far as we can tell, again to the mid-late 13th century. There's a reconstruction of them there. That's one of the surviving towers in the grounds of New College, Oxford. Any sense that could be another case of emulation. Okay, looking at Richard Earl of Cornwall's castle building projects elsewhere in England. This is 3 castles that Richard invested in heavily in the southwest: Launceston, Lidford and Tintagel. Castles of exactly the same period. I don't want to get into the debate about whether the roles of status and symbolism and militarism within castle design. I'll point you towards the correspondence sort of had with Colin Platt. There's an article I wrote with Rob Lydiard responding to a paper by Colin Platt, so I defer to those publications. However, there's nothing very military about these castle building projects at all. At Lidford, in Richard Earl of Cornwall's tenure, he constructs a false motte around a heightened tower, faking, I would argue, antiquity. At Tintagel, he famously draws on the mythical associations of the island in constructing the rather shabby medieval castle that you now find at Tintagel. Wonderful place, rubbish castle, I say to my students. At Launceston, Richard Earl of Cornwall is responsible for constructing the high tower on the top of the motte at Launceston. That's an 11th century motte, 12th century shell keep, and a 13th century high tower. Andrew Saunders has argued, I've argued as well, that this is in effect a medieval grandstand. This wonderful single window right at the top of that tower, with a great window seat. Suggests that that's a medieval grandstand. So Richard Earl of Cornwall's castles have an element, undeniably, of fantasy about them. Can you put Wallingford in the same category? Okay, so moving on. Here I'm drawing on a piece of work by Rob Lydiard, who I've mentioned already. At Castle Acre, Rob published a sort of often cited study that applied the designed landscape idea. Thank you, Pete. The idea that medieval landscapes could be manipulated for reasons, their impact on the senses, I suppose. He applied this idea to Castle Acre. At Castle Acre, he suggested the medieval road on the south side of the town was diverted, and that anybody approaching the town, and the road had been diverted, so had an image of not only the castle but the accompanying monastic site and the town. He suggested that this route of approach exhibited that Norman ensemble from the best possible perspective. Can we translate that sort of idea to Wallingford? I suggest we can, in a perhaps slightly more limited sense. The most compelling piece of evidence comes from the excavations at Wallingford's North Gate, carried out in the late 60s and early 1970s. As part of Richard Earl of Cornwall's rebuilding of the castle, he moved the town gate and diverted the road in from the north side. You see on this diagram here, that's the original line of the road, that's the new line of the road. So this part of the townscape is replanned around those concentric defences. The road then, it's rather strange, we've excavated a number of trenches further up here. And it's very clear that the medieval road in from the north side sort of meanders, almost like a river. And then around 1300 it stabilises, but on a very circuitous course. If you drive into Wallingford now from the north, you drive into it along this very profound kink. You have this very irregular sort of route of approach. Why on earth would the road replanned in that sort of way? Is there any sense that it's again the idea of showcasing the castle in all its glory? The imprint of authority on Wallingford in the high medieval period. Here I'm summarising the main changes to the townscape by about 1300. So the castle is transformed into what I would argue is a show fortress, a concentric piece of castle planning. The route into the town is replanned on a circuitous route. Richard Earl of Cornwall is also responsible for rebuilding the Great Bridge over the Thames. He creates, there's no archaeological evidence for this, but the documents make it very clear that in the 1240s, the Jewish population of Berkhamsted are relocated to Wallingford. This is pure speculation. This label here, the Jewish quarter, in this area here. But by looking at other sites, there's this very strong association between royal castles and Jewish quarters, juries at Norwich, at Bristol, at London, to some extent. Finally, there are two royal hospitals founded outside the south and east gates of the town. Moving on a little bit, moving in fact towards a conclusion. a major finding that's come out of the project is quite how important water was in defining the relationship between the castle and the town. Not just in the sense of the great River Thames, but the way that the Thames and other watercourses fed the moated defences of the castle, which were incredibly sophisticated. A triple moat surrounded them, were fed through a series of complex sluices. And also the way that the castle had associated with it a secluded watery landscape. The area on the east side of the castle, incorporating this feature here, on the river terrace immediately above the Thames, was a secluded area, immediately below the castle walls. It's an area now called the Queen's Arbour and the King's Meadows. Our surveys and excavations show that this was is a secluded watery landscape incorporating a number of ponds and fish ponds. This is almost certainly where the castle swannery was. And this feature, which is yet to be adequately explained, but was in place by 1300. It's a large U-shaped masonry structure projecting out immediately below the Queen's Tower. There are references to medieval gardens in this area. Is it some sort? I don't know. We can talk about it later. But is there any sense that that could be related to this watery elite landscape? These were our initial geophysical plots of the feature. And of course, when an archaeologist finds something like that, this beautiful outside lens, you've simply got to excavate it. You couldn't do that. Oh, it's not the end quite yet. Right, so on to the idea of Wallingford in decline as a reconstruction of the town about 1550. As I say, Wallingford's decline is severe and it's unusually early. Wallingford doesn't have any of the great symbols of late medieval urban prosperity. It doesn't have a guild hall, it doesn't have friaries, it doesn't have suburbs of any size. The castle is decayed, the priory is dissolved by this period, the hospitals and churches are redundant, and the bridge is in a state of disrepair. But when did Wallingford's decline really set in? All the evidence points in the same direction, and that decline Wallingford is in decline by about 1300. It's reached its maximum by then. And the more we thought about it, it does seem that the movement, the centre of the honour, from Wallingford to Berkhamsted, after the tenure of Richard, Earl of Cornwall, is probably a tipping point in the place's fortunes. But is there any sense that Wallingford's high status connections, the unusually high status presence of that castle, the size, the elaboration of the castle, is there any sort of sense that that actually held back the development of the town? Is there any sense that its high status associations retarded the town's development and stopped it becoming a fully functioning, flourishing market town? For a comparison, I don't think you have to look too far. Look at the town of Windsor. It's only 18 miles away from Wallingford. Windsor, the borough of Windsor, grew, was founded in the 11th or the 12th centuries, but always remained limited in scale, despite its uniquely close relationship with the medieval monarchy. Windsor remained a town of very, very modest size. It was never surrounded by walls, for example, despite the presence of the great royal castle. Instead, you could argue that the royal presence retarded the development of Windsor. You could argue that the town was damaged by the two medieval sieges. In the 13th century, it's very, very clear that an expansion of the castle disrupts the townscape. And also, drawing on a piece of work by Grenville Astle, it's clear that the expansion of Windsor, of the castle parks, through the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, encroaches upon the town's fields and pastures. So at Windsor and at Wallingford, I think the same thing is happening. The royal presence, the high status presence, is actually perversely holding back the development of those places. That's Windsor Great Park, of course. So my conclusion, Wallingford is a medieval town always somehow under the shadow of royal authority. In fact, I'll just read out a concluding paragraph. So to return to Wallingford and to conclude, the townscape had ultimately grown from an embryonic burh founded by the kings of Wessex that, while in some senses was a communal fortification, never really gained the independence or identity of a fully fledged urban settlement. In the later medieval centuries, as we've seen, it's again possible to caricature Wallingford as subservient to the wishes of the very highest ranks of the social elite. Perhaps Wallingford had the character of a command economy that answered the beck and call of society's power holders, as opposed to a self-sustaining market economy tied to its hinterland. In this sense, is Wallingford's history and archaeology not a model of urbanism? As I suggested at the start, is it not a model of urbanism so much as an individualistic story of a town through time? Or is it inevitable that a project such as this one, a project focused on a particular site, will always tend to emphasise points of difference and contrast with the wider scene, focusing consciously or unconsciously on why it's somehow special or exceptional? Which brings things to an end. Thank you.